For more on these double standards, especially when it comes to the big tech censorship, I want to welcome on Jenna Ellis, a constitutional law attorney and the senior legal advisor to the 2020 Trump campaign. So Jenna, I want to start with the social media aspect because that is something that a lot of people are talking about going into today. It's the idea that Facebook and Twitter took action against this post for the president saying that children are almost immune to the disease. Now, I know that we're both on Twitter. I know that you and I have seen far worse stuff posted on Twitter before, but I want to get your response to exactly what is behind these actions of Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, well, it's just a direct attempt to influence the election and to create the false narrative that President Trump or the Trump campaign is saying something that is factually false. So when President Trump says that, he's absolutely correct. And, there was actually a study done and published in Discern that is a great publication, by the way, that said that for 18-year-olds and under, the coronavirus was not even in the top 50 leading causes of death. So that's pretty much when you get a 99.999 something percentage of survivors, then that's pretty much immune. And so what all that Facebook and Twitter are doing is trying to create the perception that the president is providing false information. He's not taking this seriously, and they are interfering at this point with the election.
And I think what's problematic to me, too, is exactly what you brought up. There are studies to suggest that what the president is saying is true. I mean, there are medical experts out there. I am not one of them, but I trust what they say about that there is a debate about this topic. And I think that is something that is problematic when people in Silicon Valley are making the decisions that they know better about medical issues than some doctors who actually practice this for a living. So I think that's where it becomes problematic as well, not to mention the fact that there are Chinese propagandists and people spreading disinformation on a daily basis for a living who no action is taken against. So I think that speaks to the hypocrisy that we're talking a little bit. But I do want to pivot.
Go ahead. Kamala Harris's former press secretary that's making these decisions at Twitter, that there's bias.
And I think that it speaks to something a little bit more problematic, too, is that when you are looking at Silicon Valley, a lot of times the people there are being hired from that area within itself. Sometimes the bias, they may not know that they even have it. We all have a bias to some degree, but when you are hiring from the same area and all these companies are in Silicon Valley with people which, by the way, share the same idea, you're in the same bubble that we're talking about in social media circles that you can't get out of. You're being shared the same information. So I don't know who's to say that they're the ones who have the right to make this type of decision. But I do want to pivot to the idea of mail-in voting, because I know that the Trump campaign is now taking action against the state of Nevada for an action that they took to expand mail-in voting. It's one of the first states to take action this election cycle in this regard, trying to implement major changes just 3 months out of the election. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so the campaign filed this lawsuit to protect the integrity of the elections. And so even though we do have 5 states that do have universal vote by mail, there are instances of fraud. And this type of a scenario where you have Assembly Bill 4 that has been pushed through the Nevada legislature in 72 hours and under 100 days before the election, there is not the capacity for this. It's just going to be ripe for fraud. And they're doing this intentionally and maliciously to undermine election security protection. So what the Trump campaign and the RNC are doing is that we're fighting back for the protection of every Nevada voter. And we want to seek to invalidate the Nevada law and also restrain the Secretary of State and the Nevada government from being able to implement this universal vote by mail, and also from extending the deadline of when ballots are counted after Election Day.
And in regard to those 5 states, I just want to make this point clear. They've done this before. They didn't just implement this all of a sudden amid the coronavirus pandemic. They've had trial and error type of elections for the better part of a couple of years now in order to make sure that they get their system down in place. But what we're talking about right now is some states looking to all of a sudden expand it to a more universal type of thing. But in the state of Nevada, for example, to expand it to every resident in the state and then to experiment with that. And even during the Democratic primary, we saw some uncertainty, whether it be in Iowa, even Nevada for a little bit, about new election processes. So to say that you can all of a sudden implement a new system is problematic. And I think that, for example, some of these lawmakers in these states may know that, because now they want to make the narrative, as the Trump campaign takes action, that the Trump campaign is trying to suppress voters. That's going to be the narrative that they use coming out of this lawsuit. So do you think that there is room to be made, or do you think there is an argument to be made that this does help the Trump campaign in some way?
Not at all. And so the data just simply doesn't show that whatsoever. No one has ever been disenfranchised in any of the other states that don't have universal vote by mail. And so every state, there is a difference between absentee, which is one person requesting their own ballot, versus the state sending out millions and millions of ballots out into the ether. And so what actually happens, and where you have the disenfranchisement, is with voter fraud and with the dilution of legitimate votes when you have invalid ballots. And so that's just wishful thinking on the Democrats' part. That's a talking point to say that somehow this is about voter suppression. This is about election integrity and preserving the safeguards in the ballot box. And it's very interesting, Alex, that it's only one candidate. It is the reelection of the incumbent President Donald Trump, who is willing to take a stand for every eligible voter and rightful voter in America. It's only the Democrat Party that wants to remove the safeguards and wants to remove election integrity, rather than abiding by our constitutionally protected right to have free and fair elections in this country.
Interesting. We're going to be following that case very closely, because it could have major consequences. Nevada is going to be a swing state this upcoming election cycle, and something tells me that other states are going to look at what's happening in that state and see if they can replicate that in their home districts as well. It's something that we're going to be keeping a close eye on. But Jenna, Ellis, I appreciate you coming on tonight and breaking down this issue for us. Thank you.